Cowboy pays for old man's travel ticket. Minutes later, two stunning daughters came in front of them.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The rail station was small, a squat building of weathered boards with glass panes dulled by coal smoke and weeks of wind. Inside, the air smelled of iron and ash, heavy enough to cling in the throat. A stove squatted in one corner, its heat barely reaching the benches lined along the wall. Two lanterns hung on iron hooks, their light dim and yellow, casting shadows sharp across the plank floor. The sound of a telegraph clacked steady behind a half-closed door, like a clock that wouldn't stop. It was late afternoon and cold for autumn, the kind of cold that hinted at winter pressing in early. Outside the windows, the sky had gone pale, and dust chased along the tracks in dry spirals. A freight train sat on the far line, engine hissing low, black smoke curling into the gray. Caleb Rourke stepped through the door slow, boots dragging a trace of grit over the threshold. He didn't look around much, just took in a room with one measured sweep and stopped at the ticket counter. The brim of his black hat cut shadow across his face, but the sharp angle of his jaw and the gray of his eyes were plain enough to the clerk who looked up. Caleb reached for the roll of bills in his duster pocket. He had the amount figured. El Paso one way. It wasn't home, but it was south and far, and that was all he wanted: distance. He laid a palm on the counter, ready to speak, when he heard a voice to his left. Thin, worn out. Please, you gotta help me. Caleb turned his head, just enough to see. An old man stood at the far end of the counter, shoulders hunched under a coat the color of dirt, patched and sagging at the seams. His face was lined deep, skin pulled thin over bones that showed sharp, his hair gone to gray in uneven clumps under his sweat-stained hat. His boots were cracked near the soles, and the way his fingers fumbled at the coins on the counter said everything. The clerk's voice was flat, without give. Tickets $1.40 to San Angelo. You don't have it. The old man tried to gather the coins like maybe they'd add up different the second time. A dime rolled, and he chased it slow, knees stiff as fence posts. I got folks down there, he said, voice breaking on the words. Ain't got no place else to go. The clerk just stared at him. Caleb watched in silence, jaw set, a muscle ticking near the hinge. He didn't want to hear the man beg, didn't want to stand in a room that felt like this. He'd spent too many years seeing what men looked like when hope bled out of them. He'd sworn off caring, because caring had cost him before, cost him a wife and an unborn child in a winter that froze everything he thought he could keep. He could have turned away. He almost did. His ticket money was ready in his hand. He was headed south to take a job-breaking stock for a rancher he didn't know, because it paid cash and didn't ask questions. That was his plan. Keep moving, keep to himself, don't look too close at other people's hurt. But the sound the old man made when he breathed in, the rasp of a man who'd run out of ways to fight, stuck under Caleb's ribs. He laid his bills down hard enough that the clerk looked up. 2 tickets, Caleb said, voice even, no more than that. His and mine. The clerk hesitated, then slid the coins back to the old man and started writing. The punch clicked twice, paper tearing neat, and 2 tickets came across the counter. Caleb picked them up, turned, and held one out. The old man froze, hand hanging in the air like he didn't trust what he saw. His mouth opened and closed before a sound came, rough and low. Son, I can't. Don't matter. Caleb cut him off, not sharp, just final. He didn't want the man spilling gratitude all over the floor. He gave a short nod, turned away, and headed for the bench by the stove. He sat, elbows on his knees, eyes on the scuffed boards. The heat from the stove barely touched his boots. He didn't feel good about what he'd done. Didn't feel bad either. It was just something a man did when he could, same as pulling someone out of a ditch or lifting a wagon while clear of a rut. But he knew it would stick in his head later, how hollow the old man's voice sounded. Caleb stared at the door, thinking about the train, about how many more miles he had to put behind him before the weight in his chest shifted even a little. He didn't notice the room go quiet until the wind slammed the door open. Cold air and grit rushed in, pushing a shadow across the floor. And then they stepped through. 2 women, skirts dusted from the road, shawls clutched tight against the wind. The first one was tall, dark hair falling loose past her shoulders, face strong even under the wear of hard travel. Her dress, faded green calico, was drawn tight where the seams had given under strain and the neckline had split along one side, showing a strip of pale skin above the curve of her chest. Her boots were worn near through, hem torn where it had caught more than one rock on the road, but she walked like someone who decided long ago not to break. The second was younger, maybe 21, hair the color of straw braided loose down her back, blue eyes dulled with fatigue. She was slighter, shoulders drawn in, and the tan cotton dress she wore looked 2 sizes too big, hanging light off her frame. Every man in the room looked up when they came in, not for beauty alone, though they had that, worn thin under the dust, but because women didn't come through places like this without reason. Caleb didn't move, just watched from under the brim of his hat as the old man turned, his face splitting with something that might have been joy if it hadn't carried so much strain. "Girls," he rasped, voice shaking worse than his hands now. "Thank the Lord you made it." And that's when Caleb knew nothing about this night was going to be simple. The door eased shut behind them with a hard thump as the wind lost its grip. Grit swirled across the plank floor before settling into cracks worn deep by years of boots. The two women stood still for a beat, letting the chill fall from their skirts, shawls clutched tight around narrow shoulders. Their eyes moved slow across the station, measuring the faces, reading the room the way people do when they've had too much road and too little safety. The old man reached them first. His thin hands shook worse now as he caught the elder daughter by her arms, voice breaking when he said her name. Caleb heard it clear enough. Ruth. The other he pulled close a breath later. Clara. His fingers splayed across her back like a man who didn't expect to feel flesh warm under his palm again. His whisper was raw, torn between relief and guilt. "Thought I'd lost you both." The taller one, Ruth, bent to him but didn't lean her full weight. Her face, what Caleb could see of it under the loose dark hair, showed no tears. Just lines carved by miles and nights without enough food. She looked past her father once, quick and sharp, sweeping the room same as before, and her eyes landed on Caleb for half a second. Then they slid away. The younger one, Clara, stayed close to the old man's side, her fingers clinging to the worn sleeve of his coat. She looked like a girl still, even if the years had pulled at her frame. Blue eyes wide, lips cracked pale from wind. She didn't meet anyone's gaze. Didn't have to. Men were already staring, and she knew it. Caleb didn't move from the bench, just sat with his elbows on his knees, gray eyes cutting over the scene while his jaw set tighter by the second. He wasn't one to wonder about other people's troubles. Trouble usually spilled over when you opened the door to it. But something in the old man's voice when he'd said, "Thought I'd lost you," stuck hard. That, and the way both women carried themselves. Not broken, but near the edge. "Bah," Ruth said, low and steady now, but there was a shake under the tone if you listened. "You ain't got the ticket." It wasn't a question, more like a reckoning. Her glance fell to his hands and saw nothing but a scrap of paper folded neat. The old man held it up like proof. His smile cracked wide, all gums and worn teeth. "Got it now. Man helped me." His head turned, slow as if weight pulled at his neck, and his eyes fixed on Caleb. That one. Caleb didn't want the attention, but it came just the same. Ruth's eyes followed her father's nod and landed on him full this time. They stayed there longer. Dark eyes, level, reading him the way you read sky before a storm, looking for Waddle break and Waddle hold. Her lips parted like she meant to speak, but the words didn't come. Not yet. The younger one glanced too, quick and shy, then ducked her head. The old man cleared his throat. "Sir," his voice faltered, then firmed as if pride fought through the tremor. "This here's my girls. Ruth, Clara." His hands hovered near their shoulders, but didn't grip tight, like he knew they'd had enough hands on them already. "Ain't had much luck on the trail. Lost near everything. Only reason I'm standing here is on account of you." Caleb didn't answer right off. He felt the eyes on him. The clerk, 2 men by the stove, even the telegraph boy peeking through the door crack, but he let the silence stretch until it felt near solid. Then he gave one short nod, voice low as gravel when it came. "Don't mention it." Ruth didn't look away. Not even when the corner of her mouth tugged, like she might have said more if the room weren't full of ears. Instead, she turned back to her father. "Train leaves soon," she said. "Where's the rest of the fare?" The old man's smile dimmed, and Caleb caught the flicker of panic in his eyes before he hit it. "Ain't but 2 seats," he admitted, almost a whisper now. Couldn't stretch it further. That's when it settled in, the thing everyone in the room would have guessed by now. 3 people, 2 tickets, and no more money than what had jingled on the counter like bones in a tin cup. The clerk spoke before anyone else. "Train don't wait," he said, voice like a blade scraping stone. "Figure it quick or step aside." Ruth's chin lifted slow. Her hand brushed the torn edge of her shawl, like maybe she felt every stare burning through it. Caleb watched the breath move her chest under the green calico, the seam near her neckline straining where it had split, and he hated himself for noticing because what showed there wasn't choice. It was hard miles and fabric worn thin. She shifted her weight, squared her shoulders, and her voice came steady but sharp. "Then we ain't leaving him." Caleb's jaw flexed. He'd heard that tone before, the sound of a woman who'd walked too far to watch blood walk out alone. He looked down at his boots, at the dust ground into the leather, and thought about what was waiting south. A job, a place where no one asked him for anything. Clean start, or close to it. He told himself that twice. Maybe 3 times. Didn't matter. When he raised his head, the words came out like they'd been waiting. 3 seats, Caleb said, slow so there'd be no mistake. "Put on mine." The room went quiet but for the whistle of the wind through the eaves. Ruth stared at him hard enough to pin a man in place. The old man blinked, his throat working like he couldn't swallow what just happened. Caleb didn't blink back. He just stood, set the bills down on the counter, and waited while the clerk punched another ticket and slid it across with a grunt. When Caleb turned, Ruth was still looking. Not soft, not grateful, just measuring. The younger one clutched her shawl tighter, eyes flicking between them like she didn't know which way the ground was about to break. Caleb didn't say a word. He just picked up the ticket, tipped his hat, and walked to the bench again, the weight in his chest heavier now because he knew something sure. This wasn't ending at the platform. The whistle split the air sharp enough to shake dust from the rafters. Men on the benches stirred, pulling collars high, boots grinding grit as they stood. Outside, the engine hissed loud, sending a curl of black smoke into the pale sky. The clerk's voice barked over the low rumble. "Train for San Angelo and El Paso, boarding now." Caleb rose slow, hat brim shadowing his eyes as he slid the last ticket into his coat pocket. The old man gathered his daughters close, voice low with the kind of worry that didn't leave a man even when the hard part was over. Except this wasn't over. Not for them, and sure as hell not for Caleb. He could feel in his gut. What he'd done tied him to them now, even if no one said it out loud. The 3 of them, Ruth, Clara, and their father, moved toward the platform, skirts brushing the floor, shawls drawn tight against the wind sneaking under the door. Ruth walked ahead, steps firm despite the frayed hem dragging across the boards. Caleb's eyes followed without meaning to. Not just because she carried herself like she wouldn't let the world see her bend, but because every man in that room was watching too, and not all of them looked kindly. He caught 2 near the stove, trading a glance. One lifting his chin like he had something smart ready to spit. Caleb let his hand fall near his coat where the Colt sat easy, just in case. They read the look in his eyes and thought better. Outside, the platform was a strip of rough planks lined with crates and barrels. The wind cut hard, carrying the smell of coal smoke and oil. Ruth turned her face from it, hair whipping loose over her shoulder. She helped Clara step up onto the slat nearest the train, one hand gripping her sister's arm, the other clutching a small carpet bag that had seen better years. That was all they had between them. Caleb noticed. Noticed, too, how Clara's fingers clung tight, like the wood under her boots might split and drop her into the dark. He heard the old man murmur thanks again, voice raw like sand. "Don't know what we'd be done without you." Caleb gave him the same answer as before. Nothing but a short nod. Talking never fixed much in his experience. As they waited for the conductor to wave them forward, Caleb studied the 3 of them closer. Questions had been stirring since the door swung open and the cold brought them in, and now they pressed harder. Why were two women like them on the trail this late in the year? Where had they started from? What happened that left them with nothing but worn skirts and a father who couldn't scrape a fare for one seat, let alone three? He didn't ask yet. Not here with men close enough to hear. But Ruth must have felt the weight of his stare because she turned sudden, dark eyes locking on his. It was quick, just a heartbeat, but enough for him to see what lay behind them. Pride, yes, but something else too. Worry sharp as a knife, and fear buried so deep it barely showed through the steel she wore on her face. Boarding, the conductor barked. Let's move. Caleb stepped back, let them climb first. The old man gripped the rail with stiff fingers and hauled himself up, Clara behind him, shawl slipping to show the collar of her dress tugged loose at the throat. Ruth came last. When her boot hit the iron step, the train lurched, and she caught the railing hard, knuckles white. Caleb's hand went out before he thought, fingers brushing her arm, warm through the thin sleeve. She steadied, glanced at him once, and for the first time since he'd laid down the money, she spoke to him direct. You didn't have to do that, she said, voice low but firm. Not thanks. Just fact. Caleb held her gaze, gray against dark. I know. She hesitated, like there was more she wanted to say, then moved on without giving it air. Inside, the car smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Benches lined both sides, worn smooth and scarred by years of travel. A stove burned low near the end, heat barely enough to chase the bite from the air. The old man took a seat near the back with Clara curled small beside him. Ruth slid in on the other side, laying the carpet bag at her feet, her eyes steady on the aisle like she meant to keep it between her and the world. Caleb stayed near the front, but the distance didn't matter. He could feel the tension riding that car, same as he could feel the train shudder when the engine pulled hard. Every time the whistle blew, Clara flinched and pressed closer to her father. Ruth didn't flinch. She stared out the window like it owed her answers, jaw tight, as if holding back more than cold. Questions kept stacking in Caleb's head, and the longer he watched, the heavier they got. Were they running from something? Had someone hurt them? He didn't like the way that thought settled in his chest. He told himself again this wasn't his business. Told himself he'd walk off in El Paso and never see them after. But some part of him knew better, because trouble didn't look you in the eye like that and then vanish with the next whistle. The train jolted, wheels grinding on steel, and through the smoke-streaked glass, Caleb watched the land roll out flat and empty, mile after mile of scrub and pale grass bending low in the wind. He leaned back against the bench, hat pulled low, but his eyes stayed open. And the thought stayed too. If those women were in the kind of fix he suspected, what would happen when the next station came? And the men waiting there weren't him. The train rolled steady through the flats for near 2 hours before the weather turned. The first sign was a smear of gray stacking low on the horizon, and then the wind shifted sharp, cutting colder as if winter meant to come early. By the time dusk laid itself over the plains, the car windows were fogged at the corners and the lamps swayed with the jerk of the track. The air inside thickened with damp wool and coal smoke. Caleb pulled his coat closer, watching the glass as frost began to feather its edge. Across the aisle, the old man slumped against the bench wall, his head nodding heavy with sleep. Clara leaned against him, her face pale and small under the weight of the day, eyes closed but never easy, her fingers curled tight in her shawl. Ruth stayed upright, dark hair hanging loose over her shoulders, eyes fixed on the black beyond the glass where the land moved like a ghost. She hadn't spoken again since the platform. Not to Caleb, not even to her sister, except for one quiet word when the girl stirred and shivered hard. Caleb sat near the front, but angled enough to see them clear. Every mile raised more questions than it answered, and now the biggest one pressed loud in his head. Why were they on this road so late in the season with near nothing to their name? No wagon, no trunks, just one small carpet bag that couldn't hold more than a change or two. You didn't run that light unless you were fleeing, and that thought sat heavy, pulling other thoughts behind it. Men they might owe, or worse, men who thought they owned them. The train jolted hard, and the whistle split the night. The conductor's voice carried sharp down the aisle. "Wash out ahead. We're stopping short till morning." Murmurs rippled through the car as men shifted on benches, cussing low. Caleb felt the grind of steel on steel as the brakes clamped, the whole car shuddering to a halt. Outside, the blacks stretched wide and empty, a scatter of mesquite barely standing against the wind. No lights but the lamps in the car. No town close enough to see. The conductor came through, coat collar high against the cold that leaked in every time the door opened. "Track's out 2 miles up. Ain't safe running her in the dark. We waited out till daylight. There's an old siding cabin couple 100 yards back. Stove bunks. First come, first serve. Rest of you bunk in the cars." His eyes swept the car, lingering on the sisters a shade too long before he moved on. Caleb watched Ruth catch that look and hold it without blinking. Her jaw tightened, just enough for him to see. She turned to her father, voice low but edged. "Pa, you near frozen. We need heat." The old man stirred, groaned low, his bones sounding as brittle as the boards underfoot. Clara shifted too, pulling the shawl close, lips trembling though she tried to hide it. Men began to rise, hauling carpet bags, boots thudding as they made for the rear door. Caleb stood slow, tugging his hat down against the wind cutting through the car. He stepped into the aisle as Ruth eased Clara up with one arm and hooked the bag with the other. Her father tried to rise, but his legs shook near out from under him before he straightened, breath hissing like bellows worn through. Caleb moved before he thought, closing the space in 2 strides. "You'll take the cabin," he said, voice flat but carrying enough weight to leave no room for debate. Ruth's head snapped toward him, eyes dark and sharp under the sway of the lamp. "You don't call that for us." Her tone wasn't soft, but there was no real fire, just pride fighting the pull of need. "Not counting it," Caleb said, steady as a fence post. "Just saying it's what you'll do." His eyes flicked past her to the old man sagging against the bench, then to Clara, whose knees looked ready to give. "Cabin's the only place with heat. You want them alive, come morning. That's where you're going." For a breath, it hung there between them, wind screaming through the seams of the car and lamps throwing long shadows over faces that pretended not to listen. Then Ruth gave the smallest nod, almost like it cost her blood, and turned back to her father. Caleb didn't wait for thanks, just shifted his weight and led the way down the aisle, his hand near the Colt under his coat when he caught 2 men trailing behind, eyes fixed where they shouldn't be. One glance from Caleb was enough to turn them toward another car. For now, the night hit hard when the door swung open. Wind slapped cold across his jaw, carrying the sting of grit. Caleb dropped to the ground first, boots sinking in a sand packed firm by frost. He scanned quick. The siding cabin sat back from the track, a squat shape against the pale rise of land. One window, throwing a weak glimmer of lamplight like the stove inside, had seen a match in the last year. He motioned with his chin. "This way." The old man came slow, boots dragging, breath harsh as he clung to Caleb's arm for balance. Ruth followed close, her shawl whipping loose until she caught it, holding Clara tight against her side. Caleb kept his pace even, his eyes cutting the dark for movement. Too much open ground. Too many shadows that weren't trees. When they reached the cabin, Caleb shoved the door wide, heat hitting his face like a weak slap. One stove, already burning low, and a row of bunks nailed to the far wall. A rough table, 2 benches, nothing else. He stepped aside, letting them in first, then barred the door against the wind and whatever else the dark might carry. Ruth got Clara settled on the lower bunk, hands gentle even when her own shook from cold. Caleb watched the younger girl curl tight under a blanket that smelled of old smoke and iron. The old man dropped heavy onto the bench, hat sliding off his knee, head in his hands like the weight of the road had finally broke him down to size. Ruth straightened slow, and for the first time since he'd laid down the money at the counter, Caleb saw the crack in her steel. Not big, not loud, just the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one looked. Then her eyes found his, steady and dark. "You gonna tell me why?" she asked, voice low but strong enough to carry in the hush of the cabin. "Why you keep stepping in?" Caleb pulled his gloves off, laid them on the table, and let the silence hold long enough for the stove to pop in the corner. Then he said what was true, nothing more. 'Cause nobody else would. Her eyes stayed on him a second longer, searching for something she didn't find words for, then slid away. She moved back to the bunk, pulled the blanket higher over Clara's shoulder, and didn't speak again. Caleb settled on the bench near the door, back to the wall. Colt laid easy across his thigh under his coat where no one but him could see. He listened to the wind batter the siding and thought about the men on the train who'd looked too long. And he knew one thing clear. This night was just the start. The stove's glow was the only thing holding back the cold. Its iron sides throbbed dull red, heat bleeding out in slow breaths that barely reached the bunks. Wind pressed against the cabin walls, boards creaking under the strain like bones shifting. Outside, the dark was absolute, the kind that swallows sound, except for the whistle of the wind and the far-off moan of the engine sitting dead on the tracks. Caleb sat on the bench near the door, hat brim low, Colt resting easy across his thigh under the lay of his coat. His eyes weren't on the gun, though. They stayed sharp on the room. The old man was out cold on the opposite bench, head dropped forward, hat tipped to the floor. Every few breaths, his chest hitched like his body was still fighting the miles. Clara lay curled on the lower bunk, hair spilled over the blanket edge, her breathing soft but shallow. She looked worn near through, face pale as the ash around the stove, lashes dark against cheeks that had seen too much road. And then there was Ruth. She was still sitting upright on the edge of the bunk, her back straight like a post, hands loose in her lap, though her fingers worked slow, pulling at a loose thread on her skirt hem. Her shawl had slipped off her shoulders, leaving the green calico stretched tight across her frame. One seam near the neckline was torn more than before, and the lamplight caught the pale skin at the edge, just enough to draw a man's eye whether he meant to look or not. Caleb looked away fast, jaw clenching, because nothing about that tear was meant for wanting. It was hunger and hard miles, same as the scuff on her boots and the raw bite of her knuckles where skin split from cold. The silence between them sat heavy. Not easy silence, but the kind that pressed like a question waiting too long for an answer. Caleb felt it and knew what it was. She wanted to ask. He could see it in her shoulders, in the way her eyes cut to him, then away, like she was taking the measure of something she wasn't sure she'd like. When her voice came, low and steady, it carried the weight of all that silence. "You got a name?" Caleb lifted his eyes to her. For a second, he thought about giving her nothing. Habit ran deep in men like him. Men who'd seen what came of sharing pieces you couldn't take back. But something in the way she asked, calm, no tremor, just straight, cut through that. "Caleb Rourke," he said. His voice came out flat, same as always, but he felt it land different in the space between them. She nodded once, waited like she expected more. When he didn't give it, her chin lifted the smallest bit. "Why were you on this train, Mr. Rourke?" The question sat there like a weight on the table. He thought about lying, saying work, saying nothing. In the end, he gave her enough to ease the edge, but not so much it opened wounds. Headed south for a job. Quiet place. Pays cash. Ruth's eyes stayed on him, dark and steady. "You got folks waiting?" No, he didn't flinch when he said it. Didn't dress it up, just let the truth drop and settle where it fell. Her eyes softened for half a second, or maybe that was the lamp playing tricks, but then her face was steel again. She nodded slow, like she'd taken a measure of him and filed it away. Her fingers stilled on the thread. For a breath, there was nothing but the wind clawing at the walls and the stove ticking as iron cooled. Then he asked what had been burning at the back of his throat since the platform. "What happened to you all?" His tone was even but not cold. Just a man who needed to know which way trouble was riding. Ruth didn't answer quick. Her eyes went to Clara first, soft in a way that told Caleb more than words might. Then she said, quiet but clear, "Things went bad in Abilene. Pa worked a yard there, got laid off when the cattle run ended. We waited on his pay 2 months, never came. Took a room on credit, thought we'd square it when things turned. They didn't. One morning the man who owned the place showed with 2 more behind him. Said we could settle what we owed other ways." Her jaw locked on that last part. and her hand clenched hard in her lap until the knuckles stood white. Caleb's gut went tight, slow anger settling in like coals under ash. He didn't ask for details, didn't need them. He could read enough in her eyes and in the way Clara shrank smaller under the blanket when Ruth spoke. So we left. Ruth finished, voice flat now. Walked near 40 miles to catch this line. Thought if we could get as far as San Angelo, Pa's cousin might take us in. That's it. Caleb held her stare, and in it he saw the truth. No spin, no ask, just the bare bones of what happened laid out plain. He gave a short nod and let it stand. Outside, the wind dropped for a breath, then howled harder, rattling the cabin door in its frame. Caleb's hand went to the bar out of habit, checking it set firm. His eyes flicked to the gap at the sill where cold bled through, then back to Ruth. She was still watching him, her face calm now, but her eyes carrying something else. A question she didn't put to words. Maybe she didn't need to. He stood slow, boots creaking on the boards. "I'll take first watch," he said, voice quiet but final. "Door stays shut. No one comes in that ain't us." Ruth studied him like she wanted to argue, then just gave one short nod. She eased down on the bunk beside Clara, pulling the blanket high around her sister's shoulders before settling back against the wall. Her eyes closed, but Caleb knew she wasn't sleeping. Not yet. He moved to the bench again, Colt resting easy in his lap, and stared at the dark crack under the door where the wind whispered through. He told himself it was just the storm that had him tight inside, but he knew better. Men don't look at women like those two without thinking things that turn ugly fast. And some of those men were sitting in the cars right now, waiting on the night to get long enough. Caleb set his jaw and watched the door, every cinch sharp as the wind outside. Whatever else came, he'd see it first. The night stretched long. The wind didn't quit. It came in hard waves, shaking the boards and driving cold through every seam of the cabin. The stove gave off a tired glow, iron ticking as heat bled slow into the dark. Caleb stayed where he was, back to the wall, Colt balanced across his lap under the drape of his coat. His hat brim shaded his eyes, but he wasn't close to sleep. Men who lived his kind of life learned early. You don't sleep deep when you feel something coming. The old man never stirred. His breath rasped steady from the bench, shoulders hunched like they'd never straighten again. Clara lay curled on the lower bunk, blanket drawn high, one hand gripping the edge like a child scared the dark might take her. Ruth sat up a long time before lying down beside her sister, but Caleb noticed she didn't close her eyes right off. She watched him from the dim, eyes sharp, reading him the same way she had since the station. Then finally, slow, her lashes lowered, and her breathing evened. He doubted she was truly asleep, but it was near enough. Caleb shifted his gaze to the door. The gap at the sill glowed, faint from the moon, thin sliver breaking through ragged clouds. Snow had started to fall an hour back, light at first, now thicker. He could smell it on the air when the wind pushed under the frame. Snow meant cold, but it also meant tracks, and tracks were a problem if the wrong men decided to follow. The thought barely settled when he heard it. Crunch of boots outside. Light, careful, try to eat the sound, but Caleb knew it like he knew the snap of a bad rail. His jaw locked as his fingers closed slow around the Colt's grip. He slid off the bench without a whisper, crossing the room in 2 steps, boots soft on the plank. At the bunks, he paused, hand out toward Ruth. She startled when his fingers brushed her arm, eyes flying open sharp, ready to speak, but his head bent close and his voice came low as gravel. "Quiet." She froze, breath caught tight, then gave one small nod. Caleb pointed 2 fingers to his eyes, then to the door. Her face changed, just enough to show she understood. He moved back, planting himself to the side of the frame, gun raised now, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. The wind clawed once more, and then came the first knock. Not hard, not yet, just enough to test. "Evening," a man's voice, muffled through the boards, but slick with a smile you didn't trust. "Cold out here. Thought we'd share that stove with you good folks." Caleb said nothing. His thumb eased the hammer back till it clicked soft. Behind him, he heard Ruth shift, fabric brushing wood, then still. Clara stirred, but didn't wake. The old man snored on, deaf to the way the air in the room turned hard. Another knock, louder now. Ain't neighborly to keep a door shut on a night like this. Open up, friend. Caleb's voice came calm, level, but it carried weight. Cabin's full. A pause, then a chuckle, low and mean. We ain't a skin for bunks. Just a little heat and some company. That last word curled foul in the air. Caleb felt his teeth grit. He shifted his stance, gun steady, eyes on the latch. Door stays shut, he said, quieter than before, but the kind of quiet that cut. Boots scraped outside, more than one pair now. Shadows moved against the slit of moonlight under the sill. 3 men, maybe 4. Caleb caught Ruth's eyes in the dim. Wide now, dark with the same knowledge he had. This wasn't about cold. The voice came again, sharper. Suit yourself. Then a slam hit the boards, rattling the bar across the frame. Clara jerked awake with a cry she bit off fast. Ruth had her arm around her in a blink, pulling her close, whispering something soft while her own face stayed hard as iron. Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. He watched the door shutter once, twice, then still. Boots crunched retreat across the crusted snow. Silence came back, thick and mean. For a long stretch, there was nothing but the wind clawing at the corners. Caleb stayed by the door till his legs ached, listening, waiting for the sound of steps circling back. They didn't come. Not yet. He slid the Colt back under his coat and dropped the bar tighter against the frame. When he turned, Ruth was still sitting upright, her arm firm around Clara. Her hair fell forward, catching lamplight in loose waves, and her eyes burned through the dark, fixed on him. No fear now, just a hard, steady look that asked without words what kind of man he was, and what he'd do if those boots came back. Caleb crossed the room slow, crouched near the stove to stir the coals. The glow jumped, throwing new light over his face when he spoke, voice quiet but carrying in the hush. They won't quit easy, he said, but they ain't coming through that door while I'm standing here. Ruth held his stare for a long breath. Then, finally, she gave the smallest nod. Not thanks, something stronger. The kind of nod that bound 2 people in a way words never could. Caleb eased back to his post by the door, the Colt resting ready on his thigh again. The wind moaned outside, and snow kept falling thick. Somewhere beyond the dark, men were waiting. He knew it like he knew the ache in his bones. And if they came again, they'd learn what it cost to push a man who'd already lost everything worth losing. The wind didn't let up. It drove snow in sharp sheets against the cabin walls, rattling the window panes till frost spidered along the edges. Inside, the stove burned low, its glow throwing more shadow than light now. Caleb stayed where he was, back to the door, Colt laid easy across his thigh under his coat. His boots were planted, shoulders squared. Not the posture of a man about to sleep, but of one who expected the dark to split open any second. The old man shifted on the bench with a low groan, then fell quiet again, his breath whistling through cracked lips. Clara was curled tight on the lower bunk, one hand clutching the blanket like she feared someone might rip it away. Ruth hadn't lain back since the boots came. She sat upright, hair loose around her face, eyes on Caleb like she was reading the measure of him in the glow of the stove. She hadn't asked more questions after he'd warned her, but she hadn't closed her eyes either. Pride kept her spine straight, though he could see the tremor in her fingers where they clutched the shawl. The sound came low at first, a crunch of snow outside. Caleb stiffened, every sense sharp. He motioned to Ruth with a flat hand. Stay down. Her jaw tightened, but she gave one short nod and eased her arm over Clara's shoulder, pressing the girl against the wall. Another step, then another, this time slower. Careful, like men who think patience earns them the prize. Caleb's pulse stayed steady, but his grip on the Colt tightened till the worn steel felt like part of his hand. He slid along the wall to the window, keeping low, and eased the edge of the curtain just enough to see. 3 of them, shapes cut against the white, moving close to the door. One had a length of iron in his fist, another shotgun cradled low. The third carried nothing Caleb could see, but the smile on his face told the rest. He'd seen that look before, men convinced they owned the night. The first voice came, Same as before, but harder now. Ain't smart, friend. Locking us out in this cold. Door opens, nobody gets hurt. Caleb didn't answer. He stepped back slow, checked the bar on the door with a quick press, then moved to the table. His coat swung open just enough for Ruth to catch the Colt, cocked and ready. Her breath hitched soft, but her eyes didn't flinch. She whispered, low and sharp, "You'll kill them?" "If I have to," he said, plain as the boards underfoot. "But I'll make damn sure they don't touch you or the girl." Her throat worked once, then she gave a short nod, the kind of person gives when they stop hoping for law and start trusting the man with steel in his hand. The knock came next, hard enough to shake the frame. Caleb moved back fast, pressing to the side of the door, gun raised, barrel black in the lamplight. Another blow hit, wood splintering near the latch. The old man jerked awake, confusion flaring in his eyes, till Ruth hissed his name and pushed him flat against the wall. The third strike cracked a board. Snow blasted through the gap, and a hand shoved in, groping for the bar. Caleb didn't hesitate. His arms swung down, the Colt's barrel smashing bone with a sick snap. The hand vanished with a scream that split the night, cut quick by a string of curses. "You son of a—" The voice broke off when the Colt roared. Caleb's shot blew a splintered hole through the gap, flame lighting the cabin for a blink. Silence fell hard outside. Then came the rush of boots retreating through snow. A shout, "He's armed! Back off!" Caleb stayed where he was, breath steady, guns smoking in his grip. He listened. Boots pounded away, fading into the howl of the wind. No more voices. No more steps. Just the sound of the storm chewing up the tracks. Slow, he lowered the gun, eyes still fixed on the door. The bar held, though the frame was split where the blows landed. He shoved the broken board tight with his boot and dragged a bench against the door for good measure. Only then did he turn. Ruth was on her feet, shoulders heaving, eyes locked on him like she wasn't sure what she'd just seen or what it made of him. Clara clung to her sister's waist, wide-eyed and trembling. The old man sat hunched, lips moving soundless, his hands shaking hard as he gripped his knees. Caleb holstered the Colt, the motion slow and calm like the gun hadn't just spat fire in a room full of fear. "They won't try again tonight," he said, voice even. "Storm's too heavy. They'll run for the cars and wait out." Ruth's chin lifted, sharp, though her voice came low. "And after?" Caleb held her stare, gray eyes cutting through the dim. "After, they're your problem if you walk out that door alone." He stepped closer, close enough the lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the grit in his face. "Or you can let me see you through." She didn't answer fast. Pride fought in her eyes, that same fight he'd seen since the station. But there was something else now, too, a crack in the steel, just wide enough for truth. Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked down at Clara, then at her father, hunched like a man who couldn't stand another mile. And when her gaze came back to Caleb's, the fight had cooled. "All right," she said, quiet as the last flick of flame in the stove. "We stay." Caleb gave one slow nod. He didn't smile, didn't soften, just moved back to the door, set his back against it, and waited for the night to pass, because come morning, this wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The storm broke near dawn, leaving the world drowned in white. Snow lay heavy on the scrub and rail ties, the kind that muffled every sound except the low groan of the wind curling through gaps in the siding. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the sour smell of damp wool and burned wood. The stove had gone black hours ago. Frost etched the inside of the window glass, and the lamplight was dead, leaving only the gray wash of early morning pushing through the cracks. Caleb hadn't slept. He stayed by the door all night, Colt across his lap, eyes fixed on the slit of light under the frame until it went from black to pale silver. His back ached, his legs felt like stone, but he didn't move until the crunch of boots outside faded from his head. They hadn't come back, but he'd bet hard they weren't gone. Men like that didn't let go easy, not when they thought they'd staked a claim. He stood now, stretching slow, every joint stiff from cold and stillness. The bar held firm. The bench he dragged against the door sat where he left it, rimed with frost from the gap. He lifted it aside, unlatched the bar, and eased the door just wide enough to look out. The wind slapped his face sharp, carrying air that cut like a blade. Snow piled waist-high against the threshold, glittering under a sky the color of steel. Beyond the drift, the siding cabin crouched alone, nothing but white in all directions, except for the line of the track, black and straight, and the engine sitting like a hulking shadow 200 yards on. Movement caught his eye, shapes by the train. Men, 4 of them, huddled near the rear car, breath showing in white plumes as they stamped their boots against the cold. One leaned on the rail, shotgun easy in his grip. Caleb watched a long second, jaw tight. They'd wait. Men like that always did. Wait till you stepped out with something worth taking. Behind him came a soft stir, the scrape of blankets, the whisper of a shawl sliding off rough wood. Ruth stood from the bunk, dark hair mussed from the night, her green calico wrinkled and torn worse than before. The neckline gaped where the seam had given, and she pulled her shawl tight without thinking, tying the ends hard under her throat. Her eyes, though, those didn't look tired. They were sharp, steady, and fixed on him. "They're out there," she said. Not a question. She'd seen the truth in his face before he shut the door. "Yeah," Caleb answered. His voice came flat, like the cold had frozen the edge clean off it. He set the bar back and turned to her. "You walk to that train alone, they'll tear you apart." His eyes cut to Clara, still curled on the bunk under a heap of blanket, blue eyes peeking wide now, fear bright in them. The old man stirred too, groaning low, trying to sit up, his hands trembling worse than last night. Ruth crossed the room, boots whispering on the plank, until she stood near enough Caleb could see the raw red on her knuckles, the cracked skin at her wrist where the cold had chewed her through. "What's your plan?" she asked, voice low but hard under the softness. Not pleading, demanding. Caleb stared a second, then spoke like he'd carried the words since midnight. "You ain't taking that train. Not today. Not with them on it." He nodded toward the white beyond the door. "I got a place south, 3 miles across the flats. Cabin's tight, stove works, roof don't leak. We hole up there till this blows over and those bastards clear." Ruth's chin lifted a hair. 3 miles in this. Her eyes flicked to the snow stacked against the door. "Pa can barely stand. I'll get him there." Caleb's tone left no crack for doubt. He pulled on his gloves, flexed his fingers once, then grabbed the saddlebag he'd left by the bench. "We move now. We make it before dark. You stay, you're done." Silence settled sharp as the cold outside. Ruth's jaw worked once, pride kicking like a wild horse behind her teeth, but then her gaze dropped to Clara, small, shivering, eyes round with a fear she tried to hide. When Ruth looked back at Caleb, the fight was gone, burned out by something heavier. "All right," she said. Just that. 2 words, quiet but carrying the weight of every mile she'd walked to keep those 2 breathing. Caleb nodded once, brisk. "Wrap tight. Take what you can carry." He shoved the door wider, snow spilling and cold enough to bite bone. The wind slapped hard, knifing through his coat as he stepped out to kick a path. Boots crunched deep. Behind him, he heard movement. Ruth waking Clara with a soft murmur, pulling her up gentle, bundling her in a shawl so tight it looked near sewn. The old man grunted, curses low as Ruth braced his arm over her shoulder. By the time they stepped into the drift, Caleb had the Colt at his hip and his rifle slung, eyes sweeping the white stretch to the engine. The men were still there, watching. One lifted a hand slow, like he meant to wave. Caleb didn't wave back. He shifted the rifle higher on his shoulder and started south, cutting a line through the snow that those behind him could follow. The wind hit hard, driving grit that stung the eyes and filled every seam. Ruth came close behind, steady under her father's weight, Clara clutching her skirts like the snow might swallow her whole. Caleb didn't look back often, but when he did, he saw Ruth's face turned against the wind, jaw tight, dark hair whipping loose under the shawl. Saw the steel in her eyes even now, when the cold bit and her boots sank to the ankle. And something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that said this fight wasn't just about keeping them breathing. It was about more than that. They moved slow, every yard a drag against the storm. By the time the sun cut weak through the clouds, The cabin rose out of the white. A squat frame crouched low against the land, smoke curling lazy from a pipe like a promise. Caleb felt the knot in his chest, ease just enough to breathe deep. He pushed the door open, heat rolling out from a stove, already lit from his last trip through. He turned as Ruth stepped in with Clara clinging close and the old man near folding in on himself. Caleb took the weight from her, hauling the man to a bench while she sank on the bunk, shawl slipping, breath heaving like bellows gone dry. When her eyes found Caleb, they were dark and burning, but not with fear anymore. Something else lived there now, something quiet, steady, and sure. She opened her mouth like she meant to speak, then closed it. Instead, she just nodded once, slow and deliberate. Caleb hung his hat on the peg and laid his rifle across the doorframe. For the first time in a long time, the fight in his chest didn't feel like a weight. It felt like purpose. The cabin door slammed against the wind and shut with a thud that seemed to drain the last of the storm from their backs. Caleb dropped the iron latch in place and stood for a moment with his hand braced against the frame, chest heaving, cold cutting through his coat like glass. His gloves were stiff with frost, boots soaked near through, but the heat rolling off the stove hit him square and hard, pulling the ache deep into his bones. Behind him, Ruth eased Clara down onto the bunk, stripping the wet shawl from her shoulders and wrapping her in a wool blanket. The girl clung tight for a breath, her lips blue but pulling color back fast in the warmth. Ruth's own face was raw from the wind, cheeks burning red, dark hair matted in loose ropes that clung damp to her throat. She straightened slow, tugging her bodice where the seams had pulled near open in the fight with the snow, then tied the shawl snug again without a word. The old man sat hunched on the bench, breath rattling but steady, hands working slow to thaw as Caleb shoved another split log into the stove. Flame leapt high, licking at the iron, throwing orange light across the plank walls. The smell of smoke and sap filled the room, sharp and clean after the stench of coal and train cars. Caleb stripped his gloves, flexing stiff fingers as blood crawled back into them. His rifle leaned in the corner now, cold holstered, but his mind hadn't quit scanning angles. Windows, door, the drift of prints outside. The men at the siding were still out there. Maybe they'd lost the trail in the white. Maybe not. Either way, they wouldn't find 3 miles of flat in a storm this thick. Not tonight. He dragged the second bench to the door, wedged it tight under the latch, and only then let himself breathe like the fight had eased. When he turned, Ruth was watching him. Not quick glances now. Watching full, her hand still on the knot of her shawl, her chest rising slow under the worn green calico that had been hanging on by threads since yesterday. The lamplight softened nothing about her. It showed the grit ground into her knuckles, the raw crack of her lips, the hollows carved by hunger. And still, she stood like a post that wouldn't bow. "You always carry trouble on your back?" she asked. Her voice was rough with cold, but steady, a shadow of dry humor threading under the words. Caleb's mouth tugged, not quite a smile. Only when it needs carrying. Silence fell a beat, warm this time, layered thick with things neither had said, but both had felt since that first look across the station. Ruth stepped closer, slow, her boots whispering on the plank. She stopped a pace from him, head tipped back just enough to meet his eyes. The dark in them wasn't hard now. It was something else, something quiet and sure, like she'd measured what stood in front of her and made peace with the answer. "You could have walked away," she said. "Could have left us to the cold. To them." Caleb shook his head, once slow. "Don't reckon I could have lived with that." Her breath came sharp, softer than a sigh. The fire cracked loud in the hush, throwing sparks that danced across the iron like stars fallen into black. Clara shifted on the bunk, murmuring in half-sleep. The old man slumped deeper, his snores breaking like distant thunder. But in the space between Caleb and Ruth, everything tightened until the air itself seemed to hold still. She moved first. Not much, just one step, enough that the edge of her shawl brushed his coat. Her fingers lifted, hesitant at first, then firm when they caught the ruff of his sleeve. Caleb's pulse hammered once, hard, and then his hand came up slow, curling around hers, the fit so right it near startled him. Her eyes searched his, dark fire lit deep, and in them he saw the truth clear as sunrise. Not fear, not need, choice. When he bent, his hat brim tipped against her hair, and his mouth found hers in a kiss that started soft but held the weight of every mile, every silent look, every breath they hadn't taken till now. Her hands gripped his coat, pulling close, and for a long moment there was nothing but heat and the crackle of the fire swallowing the dark. When they broke, her forehead rested against his, breath warm on his cheek. He kept his voice low, steady, the way a man speaks when he's laying down the last piece of his heart. You and yours stay here. Storm clears, I'll ride to town. File what needs filing. Make it so no man lays claim to you but me. Her lips curved, just a flicker, small but real. You mean that? Every word. Behind her, Clara stirred again, whispering her sister's name. Ruth turned, smoothed the blanket over the girl, then looked back at Caleb. Then we stay, she said, final as a vow. Caleb's chest eased for the first time in years. He unbuckled his gun belt, laid it on the table, and crossed the room to throw another log on the fire. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, the heat climbed steady, bright against the cold pressing on the walls. Tomorrow would bring Miles and papers, and whatever fight those men had left in them. But tonight, the door was barred, the stove was lit, and for the first time since his world went to dust, Caleb Rourke wasn't alone.